Hi, everybody. Hope we're having a great day today. We are going to dive into a really interesting topic from American history known as Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most important pieces of American literature, which is weird because you're probably thinking, hey, this is history, not language arts. But this book has a profound effect on society and events in history. And at one point, Abraham Lincoln even alluded to it being one of the causes of the Civil War. So I think it's going to be worth our time to really deep dive into this and understand it. But before we get into it, let's do a little bit of background information. This is the antebellum period, the time before the Civil War. Ante is Latin for before, bella, the root word of bellum, meaning war. And this is the time period we see a lot of events that lead to our country becoming more and more divided. And the main issue that we're arguing over is slavery. We also sometimes refer to this as a sectionalism period in which we see our country breaking into different sections, fighting over the interest for their section and not what's necessarily good for the country as a whole or what is right. And we really get divided on the North and South, with the West kind of being caught in the middle and the North and South fighting over what happens to the West. Some key events that lead us up to this include the Missouri Compromise, the Abolition Movement, the Compromise of 1850, and the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the Compromise of 1850 is when our first test, and we had this fracture in our country. Do we add more states? And if we do, are they free or slave states? Because there's a delicate balance in Congress. And if we add one and not the other, it could shift the balance and shift how everyone perceives, the fear being slavery expanding everywhere or slavery being abolished everywhere. So the compromise created by Henry Clay basically said that we would keep the balance even by adding Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. That's how we kept the balance. And then we drew this line across the bottom part of the United States and all the new territory we got in the Louisiana Purchase along that 3630 line and said that slavery could not exist above it. At the same time, we have the beginning of the abolition movement, the movement to end or abolish slavery. And it really goes hand in hand with the Underground Railroad. We see people who want to get rid of slavery immediately, people who are, we got to let slavery slowly die out. And then some people who didn't like slavery, but they really weren't advocating against it. But this is going to divide our country as more and more people are speaking out slavery, whereas slavery is such a integral part of the South that they're not willing to give it up, and it further divides our country during this time. And then the big thing that changes things is we see the Compromise of 1850 was created by, again, Henry Clay, the great compromiser. It was a series of laws to keep our nation from splitting up. And again, it's a temporary band-aid. It doesn't fix the problem. And it's a series of laws that were trying to compromise and make everyone happy or able to live with, what was going on. So California is added as a free state. Territories in New Mexico and Utah could decide for themselves if they wanted slavery. The sale of slaves would be banned in Washington, D.C., but slavery was still allowed there. Texas and New Mexico would be separate from each other. Texas tried to claim that belonged to them, and we kind of clearly drew the border of Texas. And then probably most importantly out of this, they enacted what we know as the Fugitive Slave Law. And this law required all citizens to assist in the return of enslaved people who escaped from the owners. And there's some other parts of this law that made it really hard for someone. Even if you were a free African American in the North, you could be accused of being a slave and sent into slavery. So our nation is just dealing with all these things, and all of our topics just are temporary fixes. It became very hard to avoid the Civil War because we just weren't addressing the problem. We kind of just kept pushing it off, and a lot of these topics are all things that are part of understanding this and would have been background in topics we covered before we dive right into Uncle Tom's Cabin. So I just wanted to go over them before we go fully into it. Now, how does Uncle Tom's Cabin fit into this? Well, this is going to be a book that becomes wildly popular in the early 1950s, selling hundreds of thousands of copies at a time where not everyone could even read. So it tells you how big of a deal it was. And it's going to further divide us over the topic of slavery. This book, it outlines the horrors of slavery. And many Northerners did not like slavery, but didn't call for it to be abolished either until they read this book and learned the horrors of slavery and then started to really think, hey, we need to get rid of slavery. And at the same time, many Southerners saw this as a completely unfair description of slavery and the way things were, and really just propaganda that badmouthed the South and their way of life, further dividing us. So this book really is an example of literature that shows this divide in our country. And it's really important to study because it's a great way to see how the two sides are viewing the same issue and how it ties into the coming of the Civil War. So what we're going to do today, after you finish listening to these intro notes, is then you're going to do an interactive gallery where you actually are looking at different aspects and information about the book, as well as some excerpts from the book, to get an understanding of what this book's all about and how it ties into dividing our country, which then sets the stage for the Civil War. So after this, go to your Google Classroom and begin working on the interactive gallery on Uncle Tom's Cabin.